This is a story about choices that drastically reshape the lives of the main characters, leaving behind indelible marks. Dive into this compelling narrative, filled with unpredictable twists and deep human emotions. As the servers and kitchen staff moved around Minua, carefully navigating between tables and arranging the crockery, Frank Walker sat at the far end of the table, observing the crowd. He watched as other guests enjoyed themselves, some strolling outside, others taking calls. Drinks were poured, coffee was served, and the evening's festivities continued. But Frank's mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with an unexpected message delivered by a nameless server. The note warned him about a possible threat. Mark Leia, it claimed, had his sights set on charming Frank's wife. Surprised and skeptical, Frank scrutinized the message again, glancing up to see his wife dancing with Leia. His concern grew when they disappeared from sight once more. Determined to intervene, Frank stood, but before he could act, the music stopped. He relaxed for a moment, watching them leave the dance floor. Leia escorted his wife back to the table, but instead of returning to Frank, they approached Mark's group. Frank watched as his wife joined the conversation with Leia and his acquaintances. Shortly after, Leia departed, and his wife, after briefly expressing her affection, excused herself to the restroom. Frank observed her as she made her way across the dining room toward the corridor. Something felt off. Her declaration of love before heading to the restroom seemed odd, almost forced. Sensing there was more to her departure than she admitted, Frank decided to follow. But just as he stood, Leia and his companions, as the note had forewarned, rose from their seats and blocked his path. Frank had built a career solving complex issues for various organizations. Every week he traveled to different countries to address crises in corporate operations or financial management. He routinely dealt with egotistical, power-hungry executives who clawed their way to the top through deception, manipulation, and coercion. Many times Frank had been met with resistance, bullying, and even threats, including from a narcotics syndicate when he relocated a U.S. manufacturing plant from Mexico to Alabama. But none of that ever deterred him. He thrived in facing down ruthless, self-serving individuals, and this moment would be no different. As Leia and his group confronted him, Frank calmly reversed the dynamic. With just a few sharp words, he made them acutely aware of the consequences of their actions. Intimidated, they quickly stepped aside. With his path cleared, Frank hurried after his wife. He caught up to her near the back exit of the venue. "Brooke," he called. She didn't respond, her steps steady as she continued toward the door. Frank quickened his pace, calling out again, "Brooke, where are you going?" Finally, she stopped and turned, irritation and surprise crossing her face. Frank could tell something was wrong. Her demeanor was distant, her annoyance at being followed obvious. "What are you doing here?" she asked defensively. Frank paused, trying to read her expression. "I could ask you the same," he replied. Brooke hesitated, her eyes avoiding his. She seemed conflicted, caught between the truth and what she could say to keep Frank in the dark. He pressed again. "Where are you going?" Sighing, Brooke realized she had no plausible excuse left. She couldn't lie. It would be pointless. Frank would see through any fabricated story. She needed to tell him the truth, though it would undoubtedly cause him pain. Earlier that evening, after leaving the restroom, Brooke had passed by Mark Leia's table. He noticed her, stood up, and introduced himself with the charm of a local celebrity. After a brief exchange, she returned to Frank's table. When the band started playing, Mark approached their group. Everyone was excited to see a well-known sports figure, and Mark easily made his rounds, shaking hands, taking selfies, and signing autographs. Then, he asked Brooke to dance. Initially, Brooke declined, but Mark was persistent, and with encouragement from others at the table, including Frank, she finally agreed. Nervous, she let Mark lead her to the dance floor. But as they danced, something unexpected happened. Mark's presence was magnetic. He was young, athletic, and an impressive dancer. His touch resonated with her in a way she didn't expect, and their conversations flowed naturally. As the night progressed and they danced more, Brooke found herself increasingly drawn to him. What started as simple intrigue quickly escalated into undeniable attraction. By the end of the night, Mark led her to a more private corner, where he kissed her. His intentions became clear. He wanted her to leave with him. He painted a vivid picture of their evening together, promising her an unforgettable night. Sitting at the table with Frank, Brooke weighed her options. She knew leaving with Mark would be a betrayal. Yet, the pull she felt toward him was powerful. Mark wasn't just a local athlete. He embodied a fantasy, a break from her routine, a momentary escape. The allure was irresistible. She convinced herself that Frank would understand, that he would see this as a unique opportunity for her, even if it meant temporarily straying from their relationship. Now, standing at the back exit, with Frank demanding an explanation, Brooke struggled to justify her decision. She wanted to believe Frank, her closest confidant, would forgive her, would understand her need for this fleeting adventure. But deep down, she knew that her choice was rooted not in logic, but in raw desire. "Frank, I'm going with Mark," she finally confessed, bracing herself for his response. "Why?" Frank asked, his voice controlled but firm. "Because he invited me, and I want to," she replied, her words hesitant but honest. "At this moment, I'll call or text you later to explain everything, but for now, I have to go." "Mark is waiting," Brooke explained, her voice shaky. Frank, maintaining his calm composure, stood firm, refusing to let her pass. "No," he said, dismissing the idea of a later explanation. "You need to tell me what's happening right now." "Oh God, Frank, please don't make a scene. Just let me go, and I promise I'll explain it all afterward," Brooke pleaded, her frustration starting to show. "No, Brooke. I need to understand what's happening right now," Frank insisted, his voice rising, tension building between them. Brooke, now feeling cornered, became defensive. "Frank, you don't command me. Move aside and let me go," she retorted, her voice harsh. "No, Brooke," Frank countered, his voice unwavering. "You're my wife, and you're not leaving until you explain yourself." Realizing Frank wasn't going to let this go, Brooke sighed deeply, the weight of the situation pressing on her. "Frank, I know how terrible this sounds, and I can't believe I'm doing this either, but I'm going to Mark's place. Just for tonight," she blurted out, quickly adding, "But Frank, it's only for tonight. He'll bring me back tomorrow." The words hit Frank like a ton of bricks. His mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what Brooke had just said. She was planning to spend the night with Mark. It took him a few moments to collect himself before he spoke again, this time, his anger surfacing. "No, Brooke, you're not spending the night with him. You're not going to some sleepover. You're planning to be intimate with him, aren't you?" Frank's voice cut through the air like a knife. Brooke, unable to meet his gaze, stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Tell me the truth, Brooke. Is that your plan?" Frank demanded, his voice growing more intense with every word. After what seemed like an eternity, Brooke finally responded. "Yes, Frank, you're right. I'm planning to be intimate with Mark," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence hung in the air as Frank processed her confession. The woman he loved, the woman he trusted, had just admitted she was going to be with another man. For a brief moment, Frank lost his composure. "What am I thinking, Brooke? I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I think this is insane." "That's what I'm thinking," he exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. Brooke, startled by Frank's rare outburst, took a step back, fear creeping into her heart. She had never seen him so angry, and it terrified her. "Oh God, Frank, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she cried, still unable to look him in the eyes. "Why, Brooke? Why are you doing this?" Frank demanded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Frank, I know this sounds crazy, but just listen," she implored, desperate to make him understand. "Every woman has fantasies about being with someone famous, someone extraordinary. Mark is that fantasy, a celebrity, a star. He's not just any man. He's exceptional. I just want to live out this one dream, Frank. Just this once." Frank couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So Mark Leia is your prince in shining armor? Your fairy tale come to life?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Please, Frank, don't mock me. This is real to me. It's every woman's fantasy, and I just want to experience it. Mark is offering me something unforgettable. Show me you love me by letting me have this moment," she pleaded. Frank's heart ached as he listened to her. "So, you're telling me that tonight, you'll go off with Mark, spend the night with him, and tomorrow you'll come back to me like nothing happened? Like this is normal?" he asked, his voice filled with bitterness. "It's not an affair, Frank. It's just one night. I'll come back and we'll move on. I'll be happy because I'll have lived out my dream, and you'll be happy because you supported me," she said, her voice trembling as she hoped for him to understand. Frank's eyes narrowed as he stared at her. "So, you're discarding me for the night? Choosing to be with this man you think is so much better than me?" he asked, the pain in his voice evident. "No, Frank! You are special! You're my husband and you're a good man!" Brooke cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "Then what? What does Mark have that I don't? Is it because he's famous? A professional athlete? Is that it? You think he knows how to satisfy you better than I ever could?" Frank asked, his voice full of resentment. Brooke remained silent, her head bowed, unable to answer him. "So, you admit it," Frank continued. "Tonight, the man you want isn't me. It's him." "Yes," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Frank took a deep breath, his mind racing. "And after tonight, you expect us to go back to the way things were? Like this never happened?" he asked. "It's not about love, Frank. I don't love him. But yes, I want to experience something with him. Just once," she said firmly, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. Frank's heart sank as the reality of her words hit him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Brooke, I don't think you understand what you're asking of me. You want me to be okay with this, but I can't just stand by and watch you walk out of our marriage like it's nothing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Frank, please, I'm not abandoning you. I love you. I'm coming back to you," she insisted, her voice desperate. But Frank had made up his mind. "No, Brooke. If you walk out that door, our marriage ends tonight." Brooke's eyes widened in shock. "What? End our marriage?" "Frank, no. I just need this one night. You can't throw everything away over this," she cried, panic rising in her voice. Frank's expression hardened. "I won't live in a marriage where my wife chooses to be with another man. If you go to Mark tonight, it's over. We'll end it here and now," he said, his voice cold and resolute. Brooke stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as the gravity of her decision hit her. "Please, Frank, don't do this. Don't make me choose between my dream and our life together," she begged. Frank looked at her, his heart breaking, but his resolve unwavering. "The choice is yours, Brooke. But know that once you walk out that door, you won't have a husband to come back to." Brooke, overwhelmed with regret, wiped away her tears as she began to speak. "I regret leaving the party, but I decided to meet Mark Laval for a private moment. I won't be coming home tonight. Good night. I'll see you tomorrow." Frank's voice cut through, filled with disbelief. "Is that it, Brooke? Just like that?" His words were sharp. "This is heartless." Brooke, trembling, looked him in the eyes. "Heartless? You think I'm heartless?" "Frank, you're the one who doesn't understand. You're asking me to act like this doesn't matter, like it's insignificant." "That's what's truly heartless," she protested, her voice rising. Frank's frustration was visible as he responded. "No, Brooke. What's heartless is that you casually decided to abandon me, your husband, your closest friend, for a man you barely know." Brooke began to sob harder. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I wasn't thinking. I didn't realize—" "It doesn't matter what you thought or didn't think," Frank interrupted. "What matters now is that I stopped you before you could leave. I know what you were planning, and you know how I feel. There's no room for guessing anymore. We have to face the truth." Brooke, her face full of confusion, asked, "What do you mean, Frank?" "The truth is that Mark Laval is waiting outside for you. He's probably getting impatient. The choice is yours." Without hesitation, Brooke shook her head. "Frank, I'm not walking through that door. I'm not leaving with him. I won't destroy everything we have for someone like him. I was foolish before, but I see things clearly now." Frank studied her closely. "Just a few minutes ago, you were ready to leave me for him. What's changed now? Are you afraid of divorce?" he asked coldly. Brooke looked away, guilt washing over her. "No, it's not that. I just don't know what I was thinking. Can I assume that your desire for Laval suddenly disappeared? Or are you planning to meet him next week when I'm away?" Frank pressed. "Why would you say that?" Brooke raised her voice defensively. "I would never betray you." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "But tonight, you were ready to. If I hadn't stopped you, you'd be with him right now." Brooke trembled, realizing the truth of his words. "Oh God, Frank, what was I thinking? I can't believe I convinced myself that it was okay. I didn't think about how much it would hurt you. Frank remained silent for a moment, then pulled out the note the waiter had handed him. Here, read this. Brooke took the note, her hands shaking as her eyes scanned the words. Where did this come from? She asked, her voice barely audible. The waiter slipped it to me during dinner, Frank explained. Brooke stared at the note in disbelief. Was this just a game to him? Yes, Brooke. You were a target. Laval played you, like he's probably played other women. Brooke's face went pale as the realization hit her. I was just a conquest, she whispered, her voice trembling. Exactly. You were just another woman in his game, Frank confirmed. Feeling sick to her stomach, Brooke covered her mouth, rushing to the restroom. She leaned over the sink, her hands shaking as she splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection. Her face looked tired, worn out by the events of the night. When she exited, she saw Frank standing by the door. Without a word, she walked up to him and wrapped her arms around him, sobbing. Frank, I'm so sorry. I didn't see what was happening. Please forgive me. Frank held her gently, his voice calm. Brooke, Laval tricked you. He made you believe that being with him wouldn't have consequences. But now you know the truth. Promise me we'll never end up in a situation like this again. As they walked toward the exit, Frank noticed Laval's associates still lingering nearby. Brooke, I need to talk to them. Please, Frank, let it go. We don't need more trouble, Brooke pleaded. No, Brooke, I can't just leave it like this, Frank replied firmly. Frank approached Laval's companions, speaking with authority. Gentlemen, we don't want trouble, one of them said nervously. Good. Then pass this along to Laval. He lost tonight. He's a failure. If he doesn't want this to be known far and wide, he better stay away. The men looked at Frank, dumbfounded. We can't deliver that message, one of them stammered. Do you prefer to deal with me directly? Frank asked coldly. No, sir, the man replied quickly. We'll call him. Frank watched as they made the call. Though he couldn't hear Laval's response, he could sense the rage on the other end. What did he say? Frank asked. He said he'll destroy you, the man replied. Marc Lavalier could not avoid the consequences of his actions. Brooke fully understood that Frank had intentionally provoked Marc into a situation that might cost him his life. By calling Marc a failure and declaring his defeat, Frank set the trap, and Lavalier fell for it. Brooke was certain that Marc was doomed before he even stepped out of his SUV. Watching the clash between the man she had been drawn to and her husband, Brooke felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She believed that Marc's death was partly her fault. Had Marc not chosen her, and had she not agreed to leave with him, he would still be alive. Yet, by some twist of fate, an off-duty police officer shot Lavalier, believing he was saving Frank's life. This action prevented Frank from delivering the consequences personally, and spared Brooke from the burden of knowing her husband had taken a life. I'm relieved you didn't kill him, she confessed quietly to Frank. Why? Frank asked, curious about her sudden shift. Because it's better that the officer did, Brooke explained. Better? What do you mean? Frank pressed. I mean, it's better for everyone. Better for the police, for the media, she continued. If I had been the one, it would have been a straightforward case of self-defense, Frank stated. He was armed, aggressive, and threatened me multiple times. It would have been justified to use lethal force. Yes, but the media wouldn't see it that way, Brooke responded. They would question why you chose to kill him rather than just injure him. That's true, Frank acknowledged. But even if the media speculates, the reality remains. He was armed and dangerous. I would have had no choice but to act decisively for my own safety. Still, it would have been a huge story, Brooke sighed. And even though it was the officer, people will still blame us. Yes, they will, Frank said calmly. Prepare yourself for that. Our attorney will help, but the media will spin this into something bigger, especially since Lavalier was a local hero, a famous football player. For a while, they'll paint him as a victim. Brooke nodded in agreement. They'll blame me too. Of course, Frank said. But eventually, the real story will come out. Lavalier's reputation will catch up with him. The media frenzy will fade, and people will realize what he was, a man known for seducing married women. Eventually, they'll lose interest in him. That's all I want, Brooke whispered, for this to just disappear. In time it will, Frank assured her. For a few minutes, they drove in silence. Then, Frank asked her a difficult question. Brooke, do you regret missing that night with him? Taken aback by the directness of his question, Brooke glanced at him, offended. After a brief pause, she responded, "No, of course not. Absolutely not." Frank wasn't convinced. The long pause before her answer and the tone in her voice told him something different. She may have said no, but Frank suspected she was thinking about the experience she had missed. Her words didn't match the look in her eyes, and he could tell she was reflecting on what could have been. It wasn't a surprise to him. He had seen the shift in her behavior. As they danced earlier that evening, Lavalier had spoken to Brooke about desires that often remain unspoken, even between spouses. His bold words had stirred her curiosity, and she had been drawn to the idea of exploring parts of herself she had never considered. Lavalier had planted the seed, making her believe she could indulge in those desires with someone who didn't have emotional ties to her, a fleeting, guilt-free experience. Frank recognized this shift in her. He knew that despite her denial, Brooke was now more open to the idea of seeking intimacy outside their marriage. She had not acted on it yet, but it was clear to him that this door had been opened. Even though she had vowed to remain faithful, Frank could see that her words were more about escaping the immediate situation than a true promise. He saw the change in her tone, the hesitation in her behavior. As they drove home, Frank came to a difficult realization. He could no longer fully trust his wife. He pondered whether he could live with this distrust and accept the possibility that Brooke might one day seek out another man. Deep down, he knew she would likely embrace the chance if it came. This story leaves us reflecting on the consequences of our decisions. It is filled with tension and emotional complexity, making us question the delicate balance between desire and loyalty, truth and deception, and the boundaries we set within our moral compass. In this story, we witness the profound consequences of choices, not just in a moral sense, but in how they deeply affect relationships built on trust. As Frank navigates his way through betrayal and the near destruction of his marriage, he is forced to confront uncomfortable truths about love, loyalty, and human desires. This conflict, deeply embedded in personal boundaries and emotional ties, strikes at the heart of every relationship. How far are we willing to stretch trust before it breaks? As the famous American author Mark Twain once said, "Truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't." This story exemplifies that sentiment. In real life, emotions often push people into making decisions that defy logic. The line between right and wrong becomes blurred when our desires take hold. What Frank and Brooke face is a critical turning point. Can they rebuild their trust, or is it forever lost? This is a question many face in the complexities of relationships, where love, fear, and desire clash.